So just to begin, thank you very much, Pierre-Carl, for organizing and helping to organize, and please pass on my thank you to Benoit for the invitation. I've really enjoyed this. So this is quite new research. This is the first time sort of a bigger presentation of this, so I'm excited about this research. This is about international students, and it's in particular about international students from a university, which is this university we refer to as the MIT of the North, but that's a moniker for the University of Waterloo. So just some context, we got some new data last week, and I put together this chart. You may be aware of this phenomenon. I think it's a phenomenon that's been getting a fair bit of attention in the press. So this is counting the share of the Canadian population that is comprised of individuals that don't have any permanent status in Canada. So they are here as a foreign student, they hold a study permit, they're here as a temporary foreign worker, they hold a work permit, or they're an asylum claimant. You can see what's happened, of course, in recent years is this population has grown very quickly. It's over 3 million people now in Canada. We're hearing a lot about immigration in Canada across the country. A lot of it, as I read the papers and people and journalists want to sort of make reference to what the actual issue is and what the concern is. There's a lot of pointing to housing markets and potentially youth unemployment rates. My reading of at least the kind of the policy concern in Ottawa and at IRCC, and why they've now introduced a target where they want to, within the next 2 years, bring this share down to 5%, that the concern really is about what's going to happen to these people. Large numbers of these people have no intention of leaving Canada. They may not be able to leave Canada financially. They came here under an expectation that they were going to make a transition to permanent residency. Overwhelmingly, these are not asylum claimants or temporary foreign workers. They're people who have come here as students and have been told that the way you become a permanent resident is you pay tuition in a school and you become you graduate. That will guarantee you a work permit. We call it what we call a postgraduate work permit, and that will put you on this pathway to PR status. The problem is, of course, that if you think about the first gate as getting that study permit, and then the second gate is making the transition to PR status, the second gate is capped. There's a limit to how many people can go through that gate. And the population that's going through the first gate has been increasing much faster than what the government can possibly get through the second gate. And so we got this bulging population. And the worry is what happens to these people. And we know already that these large numbers of these individuals are seeing their visas expiring, and they're staying. So, I mean, for all kinds of reasons that are very obvious, this is a big first order problem, okay? That Canada's never dealt with. I mean, we've never had an issue with an undocumented population. So that's a bit of context for thinking about, well, how did we get here? What happened? What sort of went wrong in the management of this system? And if you go back and you look at, as I said, this is overwhelmingly about a story about international students. If you look at what happened to Canada's policy, the most logical place is to go to the 2014 federal government policy on the international student program. So this is you can read this document, and it's pretty clear when you read that document what the policy objective was. The thinking was that we could sort of address Canada's economic growth challenges, labor productivity challenges, by looking to international students as a way to boost the average human capital of the population, by sort of cream skimming migrants around the world, attracting them to the country's top universities. If you read the document, there's a reference, this term best and brightest appears a dozen times or so in this document. It's very clear. It's about the quality. It's about selecting the top end and trying to boost economic growth through boosting human capital in the population. But of course, that's not what happened, right? And so, if you then, there was a second iteration of this document, what's called officially called the International Education Strategy, that came in 2019. And the flavor, if you read that now, is very clear that now it's not about sort of the quality and cream skimming, it's very much about scaling up. It's how do we make this bigger? And the potential to make it bigger is not at the universities. I mean, a lot of the universities, if you sort of, the governments went to them and said, we need you to scale up, we need you to admit more foreign students, places like Waterloo would have said, well, we're not interested in doing that. We don't care whether they're foreign students or not. We just want the best students. In fact, that's how they do their selections. They just pool candidates. They pay no attention to, for the most part, pay no attention to whether they're international students. So the growth potential was in colleges that were facing lots of budgetary pressures, that couldn't fill their seats with domestic students, and could charge foreign students a lot of money because ultimately these foreign students were not paying for education, they were paying for permanent residency status, because they saw this was the pathway to permanent residency. This was the ticket to permanent residency. So that this growth that here is by and large not at the university level, it's college level students. So that was the first problem with the kind of the policy. The second one is, there was some oversight that international students, we know from the evidence, when you look at their labor market outcomes after they graduate, they struggle. We talk about immigrant earnings gaps. We saw some evidence on immigrant earnings gaps yesterday. Those earnings gaps are evident among former international students as well. They're not as big, but they're there. For sure, they're there. And at the college level, they're much bigger. They're much bigger. So what explains them? Well, in Canada, I think we have a tendency, my reading of the popular discourse on these immigrant earnings gaps is that they're skill underutilization. They reflect some kind of inefficiency in the utilization of immigrant skills. And my reading of the literature is that there really isn't much compelling evidence for this story. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but overwhelmingly these gaps do not, in my reading of the evidence, do not reflect skill underutilization. I think the reason why it's such a dominant explanation in the discourse is because it's politically palatable. We're living in a world in which blaming victims is not fashionable. And so it's just a lot easier to say, we are not utilizing their skills, as opposed to the problem may actually be something to do with immigrants' skills themselves. So, part of the motivation for this, a big part of the motivation for this was to say, when we look at these immigrant earnings gaps, what people are mostly doing is they're taking immigrants with the same level of education and then, conditional on education, what are these earnings differences? And then for sure you see these earnings gaps, right? Conditional on level of education, there are sizable gaps. And we say then, well, these people have the same education, they must have the same skill. And so if there are earnings gaps, it must be that the immigrant skills aren't being utilized. But I mean, like for me, I teach a lot of Econ 101 students, over 600 every term. I get to know quite a few of them. They tend to be the students at the two ends of the distribution that I get to know. The worst students come to my office and the best students come to my office. They're all going to graduate with the same degree from the same university. But if you came and told me later that the students at the top end have higher earnings than the students at the bottom end, I wouldn't think that's skill underutilization. They're really different people. There's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity within these populations in skills. So the motivation here was to say, well, what if we could actually do a more careful comparison where we take students from the same university, graduating from the same program, with the same academic standing. They've done equally well in their courses. How do we then see evidence of these skill gaps in the Canadian labor market? So this paper, I really emphasize, is not a paper about the University of Waterloo. What it is we're using the University of Waterloo to measure skills, but then we're throwing large numbers of these students into the Canadian labor market, and it's really a question about, well, how well does the Canadian labor market use these skills? And is there evidence that immigrant skills are underutilized? Okay, so here's the data. So we've got every graduate of the University of Waterloo since 2005. So there's a little over 86,000 graduates, only bachelor's graduates. We've got that linked up with all their immigration records, their temporary and permanent immigration records. That, of course, allows us to distinguish who the international students are, but it also allows us to distinguish people like me that are not born in Canada, but were permanent residents when they started their degree at Waterloo. So we're going to refer to them as foreign-born PRs. So they're immigrants, but they may have come here as children. And then we can identify, and like the residual group that doesn't appear in this IRCC data are going to be the Canadian-born students. So we measure that quite well. And then we have all their T1 income tax returns throughout their lives. And then the match rate on this, of course, linkage was done in Statistics Canada. The match rate was for these 86,000 students, they found at least one source of government administrative data, whether it was the tax data or the immigration data for 98% of these students. So we got really high quality data here. There's not much worry about selection here. How do we measure skill? It's pretty simple. We use just a two-way fixed effects model. So this model in this case is really well identified, unlike when you use these AKM models to identify, disentangle firm and worker effects in labor markets. There isn't a lot of movement between firms. Here, what you've got is you've got students. So let me just define what the cross-sectional unit is. So there's two-way fixed effects. Of course, one of the outcome we're interested in is the grade at the course level. So we have the course level grades. Every course you took, we have your grade. So we have like 3.7 million grades on these students. And we see a student identifier, so that's going to be our student fixed effects. Every student takes on average 40 courses. And so then we have what we call course instructor fixed effects here. Course instructor fixed effects are like Professor Skuterud teaching Econ 101. So we're going to assume I don't change my grading behavior over time. So everybody who's ever taken my Econ 101, we're going to sort of look at where you are in the distribution within that class. And that's how we're going to identify this student fixed effect. Gosh, it's hard to see that laser. I don't even know where it is. There. So this is going to be our measure of student quality, these student fixed effects. So if you're interested in what that regression looks like, I always find this stuff the most interesting, is that 45% of all the variation in students' grades across the whole university over nearly 20 years, 45% is just these individual fixed effects, student fixed effects. 24% is something to do about some instructors are systematically more generous with grades than other instructors in their classes. So a lot of the variation is just this kind of, something's fixed about the student or something fixed about the instructor and the course. And then you might wonder about the correlation between these two fixed effects. Well, as you might expect, it's negative. So what does that mean? That means higher ability students are seeking out courses where instructors are more generous. Low quality students find easy courses. Simple as that, right? And it's pretty strong. So what that means is like using the raw GPA is not a good measure of skill because, of course, students are going to select lower quality students select into courses with higher grades. The assumption here, the underlying assumption is, of course, and I mean, it took me 10 years to get approval for this linkage, and most of that 10 years was spent convincing my university to let me to release all these data with all the grades. And as I was doing that, I was surprised how often I would get a response that, well, why do you want to relate grades to earnings? I mean, what does grades have to do with anything in the labor market with earnings? Earnings are nothing to do with grades. I was surprised how often I got that response, because certainly for me, when I'm assigning grades, I think it's capturing all kinds of things that overlap with stuff that is valued in labor markets. Cognitive skills, work ethic, conscientiousness, maybe even some social skills, all kinds of stuff I would imagine this to. So I mean, my first order worry is when we got this data, we put on those skill measures and it didn't do anything for earnings. But it turns out that's not true. For sure, this fixed effect matters for earnings. For sure it does, as I'll show you. Okay, so what are the findings, since I very likely won't get through it all? So these are like three top-level findings, but there's a lot more in the paper. It's a big paper. It's like 50 pages, a lot of results in here. I encourage you to read it and just spread it around. I think right now where we're at, with the immigration policy and our international education strategy, this is the evidence here is really important for getting us on a different track, a more positive track. Okay, so first, Waterloo's graduates, they transition to permanent residency at twice the national average. Twice as likely to transition to permanent residency. There's little difference in the transition rates at the top and bottom end of the skill distribution. Little, I mean, there's some, as I'll show you, but not much, not as much as you might expect, given that we have a system that's supposed to screen on skill. It hasn't changed hardly at all over time. That's surprising. If if you follow immigration, one of the key parts of this international education strategy was to ease the pathway for former international students to become permanent residents. So we introduced new programs like the Canadian Experience Class program. We made postgraduate work permits longer. A lot of programs to kind of ease this transition. And Feng has some really nice work showing that at the national level, it has increased transition rates to permanent residency. But at Waterloo, it doesn't seem to have done anything. Why? Well, presumably because the University of Waterloo students have always been able to make this transition. Not all of them do, but it's presumably the ones who don't, it's because they don't want to. They don't want to settle and might get a better job in the US. And so it hasn't been binding, right? There hasn't been a barrier to this transition. So when we ease the rules, what it does is it's like affecting these inframarginal workers or workers, former students, that are lower quality, lower skill. Okay, so second, and this is the most striking result, I think, which certainly blew me away, is the average postgraduate graduation earnings of Waterloo's international students exceed Canadian-born graduates at the University of Waterloo and Canadian-born students, graduates nationally. Right? International students are outperforming these Canadian-born benchmarks. Okay? So I'll give you some sense of why that might be. Last, when you condition on sort of everything we observe, so we do this comparison of taking students at Waterloo, international students and Canadian-born students, graduating from the same programs with the same academic standing in the same year, or going out on the Canadian labor market, then you do see some earnings gaps. International students underperform on average, but not at the top end of the distribution. At the very top end, the very best international students doing just as well as the best Canadian-born students, even within programs. Okay? The return to skill, I will just tell you right away, if you look at the return to skill and a regression where you have this skill measure, this fixed effect, in an earnings regression, the coefficient on that skill measure is much larger for the international students than for the Canadian-born students, twice as big. So the return to skill is much bigger for the international students. Skills matter a lot more in determining outcomes of international students or immigrants more generally than Canadian-born students. That flies in the face of the skill underutilization hypothesis, right? Okay, so here are the results. So this is, first we sort of go through the timeline of international students. They come to Canada. There's a lot more in the paper. They come to Canada, they study, then they make these transition to permanent residency. And here are the transition rates over time. So this is years since enrollment. The reason we do years since enrollment, not years since graduation, is you can start, some of these students are transitioning to PR during their studies. And what you can see is, in fact, that used to be a lot more common than it is now. And that's because the point system made it possible to do that. The work requirements weren't necessary. You could get the threshold 67 points in the point system with just your level of education. So it used to be that students would make that transition before they graduate. At Waterloo, most students are because the co-op are taking 5 years to graduate. But so you can see that in the most recent years that very few make the transition until they graduate. Then they get the postgraduate work permit. They need 1 year of work experience to apply for PR, and then bang, you get this big increase in PR transitions. Over time, though, I don't see much. I mean, I wish we could look into the future here. Maybe there's a little bit of suggestion that these things are going to plateau out at a higher rate, but it's, roughly 70% it peaks at. It doesn't look to me like there's a dramatic increase or much of an increase here in these transition rates. Okay, how does it vary with skill? So these are the PR transition rates at the 8-year point. So when we get to, we look at about 8 years, or not about 8 years, exactly 8 years. So at this point here, about 60% have transitioned on average. But here's how it varies then across the skill distribution. So this is the 5th percentile of this skill distribution. This is the 95th percentile. You can see that certainly the very bottom end of the skill distribution are less likely to transition. The differences are not big, not huge, 15 percentage points at most. But clearly that has something to do with the screening, the screening system, how we select immigrants, that they're having difficulty finding skilled jobs that allow them to make this transition. Almost certainly that's what's happening. But I think what's more telling here is that at the upper end of the distribution, there's nothing. At the top half of the distribution, there's no difference. It's flat. So you wonder, well, what's going on here? Why is the selection system not prioritizing these highly skilled individuals who are presumably getting better labor market outcomes, as I'll show you they do? Well, I mean, a lot of it has to do, or at least some of it has to do with the fact that these students at the very top end at Waterloo are getting cream skimmed by US employers. So they're going to California and working at Google and Microsoft, and that's part of what's happening. But in fact, so we can do this kind of thing for the Canadian-born students too, and there you see at the top end of the distribution, the best Canadian-born students are twice as likely to leave Canada after they graduate than the worst students. Again, that's the cream skimming presumably by US employers. But the difference here is you got to keep in mind that throughout this period of time and this data, the foreign students did not, that transition was harder for the foreign students because under NAFTA, they couldn't get these work permits through NAFTA to work in the US. So it was harder for employers to hire these international students at Waterloo. So, that goes against the idea that that's what's pulling this down. Right? It does emphasize to me that the system is not doing enough to try and attract and retain the top end here. Okay, so here are their earnings. Here are their earnings. This is pretty simple to read. We've got different graduation cohorts. Right? Blue is the earliest, this purple is the latest. We distinguish 3 types of graduates. As I said before, we've got Canadian-born students from Waterloo, graduates. We've got international, so those are the ones who at the time they enrolled at Waterloo were international students, they were on a study visa. And then these are the foreign-born students who had PR status when they started at Waterloo, so they weren't paying international fees. I should say, one really mind-blowing number here in this data is the share of all the students at Waterloo that fall into this category. If you compare that to the national average, Waterloo is a magnet for these students for whatever reason. I think it has something to do with co-op, but we are getting huge numbers of these students. Okay, I expect if you could get the university level data and you ranked, Waterloo would be, I would put money down that Waterloo would be the top here. Okay, so what do the earnings outcomes look like? Well, this is like constant dollars. Real earnings here is annual earnings. They started about $40,000, and after 13 years, they're up to about $100,000 on average. What's remarkable to me is how little these profiles move. There's almost nothing over a very long period of time. It's pretty predictable, right? I mean, a lot has happened in the labor market over this period of time, including the demise of BlackBerry, which was a big local employer, and there's just nothing. You don't see any evidence of that, okay? There's maybe, if you're going to describe this, maybe there's some kind of steepening of these profiles over time, maybe. Okay, so let's go over here and look at these folks. Foreign-born PRs. They start roughly the same, maybe a little higher, but here that steepening of the profile becomes more evident, right? Their earnings gains are bigger. And now, look at this. This is where we're blown away. And we're still, we really want suggestions and comments, and we've, in the paper, got kind of 5 different explanations. Some of it testable, some of it not, about what's happening here. But this is incredible. right? So they're starting out much higher, right? The more recent graduates, and this steepening is very evident. As I said, 5 explanations. Without question, the most important one is that these students are doing degrees in technology and engineering, computer science, and some business. We have some business. We don't have a business school at Waterloo, but we have these business programs that are tech, mathy related kind of programs like finance and actuarial science. And if you look, there's a very clear bifurcation in the earnings outcomes. You've got at the top end, these students are just doing unbelievably well. And then you got the rest of the graduates from Waterloo. Economics maybe is a little in the middle, but there's not much in the middle. It's 2 groups. Yep. We do. So that's in the paper because we have their temporary permit. So we can see if they got a new study permit. And so a really interesting outcome. So this we restrict to full-time workers. And we don't have full-time workers, but there's ways to do that. So yeah, this you should think of as full-time workers. It is interesting. I don't want to spend too much time, but one really interesting result is that this shift in the system to encourage students to graduate and get a postgraduate work permit and then start work appears to, among Waterloo graduates, have disincentivized graduate school. Fewer are going to graduate school. Because if the goal is PR status, you got to go out and get that job and get on that path. Yeah. Okay. Here's, what we can do is, this is just Waterloo's earnings, but we kind of want to know, well, how does this compare to graduates from other universities in Canada? Of course, that's hard to do with getting other universities to agree to share their data. I've started to do that, but that's I don't want to, it takes 10 years to get universities to agree to do this. So what we did was to go to the National Graduate Survey. And the National Graduate Survey, in fact, we can do an apples-to-apples comparison. The variables are completely comparable. It's a short-term outcome. We measure outcomes 1 to 2 years after graduation, so it's very much earnings very soon after graduating. But we can compare it to university graduates at the national level and college graduates at the national level. And then we can set up a horse race. The horse race is, you've got 3 types of institutions. You've got University of Waterloo, you've got university national level, and college national level. And then you've got 3 types of students. You've got international students, the foreign-born PR students, and Canadian-born students. The permutation of those, that's 9 groups, and you could set up a horse race. Who's doing the best, and how's it changing over time? And that's what this is. So the international students, the 2005 graduation cohort, are at the bottom. They were at the bottom. They're doing almost the same, well, pretty much exactly the same as international students at Canadian colleges. Okay? You go 5 years later, it shifts up. They're in middle of the pack. The international students at colleges, where all the growth has been, are at the bottom still. And then you go 5 years later, and the international students at Waterloo are at the top. And the college students, international students at colleges, where all the growth has been, are at the very bottom still. Right? What's happening? Well, big part of it is the earnings growth in the Canadian economy of these high-tech students, these whiz kids in computer science, they're exploding. And that's where the growth is. The other part, though, that's interesting is I have another paper where we just looked at the grades data. And what you see in that data is Waterloo is becoming better over time at screening foreign applicants, high school applicants, because they learn what high schools are producing the best students and how to interpret the grades from some university in India. What does an 80% mean? Compared to another school in India, what is an 80%? They estimate regressions at the University of Waterloo. They even do this with Canadian applicants, where they look at the historical grade performance at Waterloo of students conditional on their grades from the high school they came, and they adjust. So if you're coming from a high school where grades are inflated, you get penalized in the selection. Right? They don't like to talk about that, but they do that. So they're getting better and better in screening, and they're getting better and better students. Okay? So these are just different specifications, just simple regressions. Earnings regressions, the dependent variable is these annual T4 earnings. This is just a dummy of whether you're an international student, whether you're a foreign-born PR. You know, we're sort of saying, okay, this is the thought experiment. You're throwing these students into the Canadian labor market. You condition on their year of graduation, how many years since graduation, their current age, their gender, the provincial unemployment rate. In this specification, we don't condition on field of study. Then the international students are outperforming. 5 log points higher on average. These are standard errors, so well identified. The foreign-born PR students, even more, 10% higher average earnings. Right? Again, these guys are also heavily concentrated in these high-tech fields. Now, we condition on field of study, we get a gap. Becomes negative. These guys, also negative, not as big. Now we condition on co-op. The international students are less likely to be in co-op. They're not taking up co-op for some reason, and so then that becomes less negative. And then we condition on skill, and it does nothing. Why? Because the international students are not, their skills are the same, right? On average, right? So there you go. So then what we want to know is, well, what the hell is this? What's this negative? Why is it when you take students graduating from the same program, same point of time, the internationals are underperforming? Is it skill underutilization? Answer, no. You can look at the skills. So these are skills, here's the earnings gaps. At the top end, you compare the internationals to the Canadians at the top end, nothing, no difference. All of it is at the bottom end. So then we got to dig deeper. Well, what is it? These students are struggling down here. The students that struggle at Waterloo struggle in the labor market. What is it? Well, we have all their grades. And every one of these high-tech students who are taking math or computer science in the math faculty or in the engineering faculty, they have to do breadth requirements. Because those faculties know many of those students struggle in the labor market after they've known this for years because they have English language difficulties. So quite a few years ago, they introduced breadth requirements that those students have to do English classes. They can't graduate with a math degree from Waterloo without doing English classes. And we have their grades in those classes. And what you see is that big part of this is related to their grades in those communities. They're doing really well in their math classes, but these students are struggling with English. And to convince you even more maybe that this is what it is, you guys know this literature that leverages the critical period hypothesis, this notion that after the age of 13, your brain has formed. Once you reach puberty, it becomes much more difficult to learn a second language. There's some discontinuity that happens right at 18. I came to Canada. I didn't speak any English when I came to Canada, but I was 8 years old, and probably now you can't hear that I didn't speak English when I came to Canada. But if I'd come when I was 14, the evidence says you would be able to hear very clearly that it's not my first language, right? So if you look at the earnings outcomes, let's take a group of students who've had a lot of English exposure and look at those earnings gaps we just looked at, the 5%, 6%. And that's distinguished by their age of arrival in Canada. We know exactly how old they were when they came in Canada. The Indian immigrants, there's no gap. Nothing. The Chinese, so this is mostly Chinese, but it's also Hong Kong and Korea and Japan, but mostly Chinese students. The ones who came before puberty, nothing. 0. They're doing just as well as the Canadian-born counterparts, graduating from the same programs. But once you get to 13, now it starts appearing. Right? It looks very much to me like it's language, that the reason they struggle is language. Okay, so the recommendations here are most important. If you want to deal with the chart that I addressed at the beginning, the single most important thing the government can do is return to what they used to have, which was a system for economic immigration that relies exclusively on a point system for prioritizing who becomes a permanent resident. So we've created something that looks like a lottery. I think we need to get back to this system. It's called the comprehensive ranking system. It's not a pie-in-the-sky policy proposal. It already exists. This is what used to be used. But I think we can improve this. What the CRS is a system basically for predicting applicants' future earnings in Canada. It's not a difficult thing to do. But the kind of the set of X's we use to predict is not enough. And what this study says is like we need to start conditioning on field of study, which we don't. There's no, when you graduate with a visual arts degree or with a degree in computer science, you get the same points in the system. The outcomes are very clearly very different. So we need to start conditioning on field of study and DLI, the school. The school, whether you graduate from a college or university, there has to be some distinction in the points. And then second, we need to start directing policies a lot more thinking about attraction. And we sort of take policies given that migrants come, now we just got to worry about how to screen them, who gets in and who doesn't. But we got to think a lot more about policy levers that are really aimed at trying to attract the best and brightest. And schools like Waterloo, and there are many others in the country, have a potential to attract talent, to compete for talent around the world. And we don't leverage that. We don't leverage that at all. So there are ways to set up, scholarship programs, tuition subsidy programs, maybe income tax incentives after graduation. Waterloo, I should say, I'll finish with this. Besides anything else about like the growth at the colleges and the universities, Waterloo is charging international students ridiculous amounts in tuition. And that differential has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger because, of course, the domestic fees are regulated by the province, but the international fees, tuition fees, are not. We're now at a point they're paying 5 to 6 times as much. So these computer science and engineering students that are excelling, they're paying $77,000 per year in tuition. That's the Canadian tuition rating at Waterloo, right? $77,000 a year. I mean, I think that's it's entirely possible that's also related to what's happening here. These students are collecting a lot of debt. And so when they graduate, they are not putting much weight on non-wage attributes of jobs. It's like, give me as many hours as you want. They are working hard to pay off these debts. That may well, it's hard to identify that, but that may well be part of this. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Anyway, this is the authors, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm sorry I could not be here yesterday. It was unavoidable, but here I am, and I have the pleasure of discussing this really excellent paper. I think at the time when Mikal talked about just the data, about the effort in making this linkage, at that point he should have got a standing ovation, because that is just exceptional. It's only one slide in the presentation, but it's an exceptional amount of work and of great importance. And you probably got the sense from Mikal's excellent presentation that this is a paper that is just bursting with results. And Mikal couldn't get through all of them, but I can perhaps go over some of them to make sure they're highlight some that he made, and maybe a couple of points I make will be points that he did not, in fact, get around to making. So these are just a few of the points in a paper that's very rich with detail. So there's little difference in the transitions in permanent residence between stronger and weaker University of Waterloo students. He made that point clearly. And the general trend over the last 15, 20 years towards easing in attaining permanent residence hasn't affected this group at all. Basically, they were all getting it before. They wanted it, probably. They're all getting it now. And then if we want to predict the earnings of these people, which is one of the real highlights of being able to do this linkage, we find, for example, not surprisingly, but this is very strong evidence of the way the field matters, the way postgraduate earnings matter. In other words, at the time where perhaps these things could be being considered, we also have some information about how people have done in the labor market in their early years, and that would predict their earnings stream. And of course, as just discussed, the English. So now I'm going to just go outside the paper just for a moment. I know not everyone here is an economist, but there's a bunch of people who are economists. And it could turn out in some version of the world that it starts to become important to justify that economists are getting good earnings after they graduate, because we may want to be doing this for various reasons. And so I happened to look up some of these numbers, and I just am going to give you an idea of these numbers. This is from the census. So you can see at ages 25 to 29, people whose highest degree was a bachelor's degree in economics, they make about $62,000 a year. That's a little less than business at $64,000 a year, and a little less than engineering at $73,000 a year. But if you just go through the life cycle and you go to ages 45 to 54, then you see that economics and expectation in average is well ahead, 141. And in fact, it's higher than basically all the other fields. And so if you're making this case, you want to first make sure you go far enough in the life cycle. You don't want to do the immediate ones because that won't make your case as strongly. And you want to use average, because if you look at median, you won't get this, right? And what the story seems to say is that economists, there's some fraction of economists who go out and do really well. Median, same, maybe not, certainly not as well as engineers. But on average, there are these high people who pull that average up. So this is if you're making the case. There's reasons why you might want to make that case sometime in the future. Maybe you wouldn't. All right. So that was a little aside there. Back to the paper. I guess the only point with respect to the paper here is that this is regression, and so it's sort of more analogous to the mean than to the median. All right. So I made those first 4 points. The fifth point is international students do better in the earning sense, not conditioning on field as compared to non-international students, Canadian-born students. But once you condition on field, it's worse. And then among native-born students, this is one thing that Mikal didn't get as much chance to talk about. The very good students are the most likely to leave. All right, so I want to qualify this in a couple ways. First, the very good, this what Mikal calls a skill measure, is a fixed effect from a regression. And so basically what it says is you're skilled if in the classes you take, you do better than the average in that class. So this could reflect two skills. One is it could reflect that you have strong intellectual ability in the subject matter of those courses. But it could also reflect that you're just really good at choosing courses, right? You choose courses in which you do better than the average for whatever reason. And so I thought about this for a little, and I'm not entirely sure what it matters, right? So the second skill is what we sometimes call street smarts. You know how to navigate through the system. So that's one thing. And also, while I say they're most likely to leave, they're actually not all that likely to leave. You know, most of the very good students still stay. So among the international students, the very good are less likely to leave than the less strong using this measure international students. So the more this skill measure goes up, that means the more likely you are to stay in Canada, the less likely you are to leave. So we retain the good international students, and some of them presumably are just going back to their initial country, probably because they found the opportunities in Canada not so good, so they move back. Some of them probably were going to go in any case, of course. All right. So this thing that's sometimes called brain waste, which is that we have a lot of high educated people in Canada who have come from other countries who aren't being able to use these skills. Basically, this paper doesn't say much about those. But of course, remember, we're talking about University of Waterloo graduates. We're not talking about other sorts of people who, for example, sometimes the brain waste discussion is cast in terms of people who got their degrees elsewhere. And so this paper would not be informative on that. And then I think the brain drain information we get from the paper, that is highly skilled people, both Canadian-born students and international students who leave the country, it's been very steady. It hasn't changed much over time. And it's not that small, particularly of University of Waterloo students. We're losing a lot of University of Waterloo students. But again, you wouldn't want to overestimate it either. All right. So then there are some interesting empirical points. And so then, it was basically right at the end, Mikal started talking about policy, so some interesting policy points. So in the paper, there is this discussion about DEI measures. Maybe we shouldn't be as worried about those because it doesn't look like there's that big a gap versus other things that maybe we should put more attention towards, like language training and recruiting. I would counsel the paper not to cast this so much as an either or. I think these are different things and it apply to perhaps different groups of students. It may not apply as much to University of Waterloo graduates, but nonetheless, I would suggest that. And then we get to the comprehensive ranking system. And so this is a normative statement. This is what I make it really clear. If you say, it should be a single transparent system aimed at lifetime earnings. So the reason I've got a couple of these up in red, those are ones I'm going to come back to. But anyway, that would be a normative statement in the paper. The comprehensive ranking system should include field, school identities, postgraduate earnings. In other words, it should be a richer system to predict earnings better. If what you think you want to do is attract and retain immigrants who are going to earn a lot, then you want to be able to predict that earnings as well as possible. So you want to use all the variables that help predict that. And then this last bit that was mentioned, targeted tuition subsidies and tax schemes. And again, they're in red because I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. All right, so questions about policy points. First, aimed at lifetime earnings. So that's, I happen to agree with that, but that is a normative statement, and other people may not agree. And one of the things is you could imagine different groups of people agreeing or disagreeing in their own self-interest. So perhaps, for example, future taxpayers would really like this because these people are going to come, earn lots of money, and contribute to the tax pool and help support various systems. But maybe if you're a person who needs to purchase care of some kind right now, you might want people who come in who are prepared to provide that care at a low cost because you're going to be purchasing. And there are differences in interest across the population. I think that's important. I agree with Mikal that perhaps, and this is in the paper, that sometimes business interests have perhaps had too much of a role in this because they want cheap labor for all sorts of various reasons. But we should also realize that there are some other sides to that, as I say, for example, in the senior care. Now, school identities. So I agree, but of course, just remember, this is an n=1 Waterloo. There are some other stuff that he brought in as he talked about using the National Graduate Survey, but some of the findings are very specific to Waterloo, which he said might be idiosyncratic in various ways. But I also think it'd be kind of interesting if we put school identities in there. If you could really do it well, it creates a kind of an interesting incentive effect, right? Universities would perhaps get more intake or whatever if their students were doing well, right? And that might affect the way they behave. And that's interesting. I don't quite know where to take that, but I think that's a really interesting thing, particularly if universities got more influence over intake. And then sort of in general, before I start talking about these other policies, I actually think that probably the most effective policies are at the intake side, trying to attract more students. And often we don't have the great information, but universities like Waterloo spend a lot of time trying to figure out which are the good students coming in, which are the less good ones. And I sort of wonder about a system. One of the things that sometimes causes problems for students is that they have immense lags. They apply for their visa, they try to get through the system, and they just get caught up and they don't get it for a long time. And maybe we could have some sort of system where, say, universities had so many priority ones. The students wouldn't get different paper credentials, but they might get them faster, or at least get the cases considered faster. And so to make sure that we don't lose out on really good students who want to come to Canada who just get caught up in the bureaucracy, that might be something that we could do relatively simply. Okay, so now just a couple more points. One is this idea of targeted tuition subsidies. So basically, I just have the question here. Mikal has provided some information that these might be valuable in the sense that the high quality students do better, but that really is only part of the picture you need to analyze a policy, right? You need to know, for example, is something like what the elasticities are. So would Canada just end up subsidizing students who would come anyway, right? If they wouldn't, if it doesn't make any difference on that margin, then the policy would have little point. And then, of course, you have to think about and what happens about the students who leave, right? So there are a certain number of students who probably come to Canada because however problematic entrance into Canada has sometimes been, it's a lot easier than getting into the United States. And so what they do is they take a kind of their two-step approaches, first Canada, then the United States. Well, do we really want to be subsidizing the tuition of people who are doing that, right? So we just want to think about that, right? And again, it all depends on elasticities and numbers. And I just think that the way I would characterize Mikal's recommendation with his co-authors is this is something we should think about, but it's perhaps a little short of a full policy yet. And then when we think about outflows, we think about tax schemes. So tax schemes are mostly about retention. Same question. Would Canada just end up incentivizing students who would stay anyway? So most do. So, and those tax incentive systems, for example, I happen to know, can't see Ted, but New Brunswick tried one for a while. And I think generally speaking, the numbers weren't that great on it. That was just at the provincial level. You have to worry about that you're incentivizing students who would stay anyway. So the other thing about this is, so why do people leave? Sometimes people leave because the matches that they would get in another country, sometimes they leave because they just want to go home to their country. That perfect sense. But sometimes they leave because they want to go, say, to the United States or someplace where there's an extraordinarily good match, right? For example, there are entire industries in the United States that essentially don't exist in Canada. So here's my example. Should we have retained Ryan Gosling? Would there be any tax scheme that would have retained Ryan Gosling, right? Obviously not. And he went to a much better match. It's hard to imagine what would have happened to him if he'd stayed in Canada, but he makes at least 1,000 times more money by going to the United States. And so, this is one of the things I think we should think about, that some of this outflow is actually kind of a good thing for the world, and we shouldn't worry about it too much. Thanks very much.